Welcome to FanFic Nation. Dive into the world of imagination. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment to join the adventure.
This novel is written by JD787. What a coincidence! Of course, Aegor knew exactly what Meister Eamon was referring to. The death of Jon Arryn marked the beginning of the main storyline. It was an important moment, a pivotal turning point in the grand scheme of things, but right now he didn't have the energy to think about such matters. Nearly 10 days and nights of fleeing had left him utterly drained, physically and mentally. Although he had managed to hold his own during his interrogation by several high-ranking members of the Night's Watch, his composure had come at the cost of what little strength and clarity he had left. By the time it was over, it felt as though the last bit of his brainpower had evaporated. Supported by 2 rangers, he barely made it to the confinement room before collapsing onto the bed and falling into a deep sleep. The so-called confinement, which was more akin to semi-imprisonment, lasted several days. For most, such a punishment would have been a torment, but for Aegor it was a blessing. He spent his days eating and sleeping, not even required to participate in training. It was an unintentional respite, one that allowed him to rest for hours on end and finally regain his strength. But after he had rested enough, it was time to confront the issues weighing on his mind, his future, his fate. Littlefinger had killed the previous Hand of the King. During the King's impending tour of the North, Robert would invite the Warden of the North, Eddard Stark, to take on the role. And from there the Game of Thrones would begin. But what did all this have to do with him, a member of the Night's Watch? Practically nothing. The only connection was that the late Jon Arryn had been the Lord of the Eyrie, the Warden of the East, ruler of the Vale, and liege lord of the Royce family, Waymar Royce's family. How would Bronze Yohn Royce react when news of his lord's death and his son's disappearance reached him? Perhaps if he was lucky, Yohn would be too preoccupied to pursue the man who killed his son. Perhaps he would simply let the matter go. Aegor laughed bitterly to himself. Pinning his hopes on someone's indifference or mercy was a gamble, and a stupid one at that. This was a cruel world, and such gambles rarely paid off. The wrath of the Royce family, however, was far removed from his immediate concerns. Aegor had more pressing problems to deal with. Benjen Stark had been recalled to Winterfell by his older brother to attend a feast welcoming the king. When Benjen returned to the Wall, he would inevitably lead a ranging party north in search of the White Walkers and Waymar. As the one appointed by the chief ranger to act as a guide, Aegor had little doubt that his fate would mirror that of the ill-fated rangers in the original timeline, either dead in the snow or turned into a living corpse, much like Benjen himself. Neither option was acceptable. He had to act. Through a conversation with the Black Brother who delivered his meals, Aegor learned that Gary had finally woken from his coma. He decided to visit him after lunch. If he could get a moment alone, he might be able to ask Gary about a way to cross the canyon. True, his current restrictions meant he couldn't access the stables or leave the camp, but walking around Castle Black was still allowed. But before he could put this plan into action, he was summoned by the Night's Watch leadership. "Are we setting off already?" Aegor thought nervously as he entered the meeting room. The scene inside was eerily similar to the one during his interrogation. The only difference was that someone unexpected was seated in the interrogation chair. "Will, you're alive, Aegor," the man turned to him, his voice full of surprise. The speaker, however, looked haggard. When Aegor and Gary had fled, they'd taken the only 2 horses left. Waymar's warhorse had returned to Castle Black earlier, but without a mount or supplies, Will had been forced to make his way back on foot. The journey had taken longer and been far more grueling. If not for his survival skills as a former poacher and his ability to evade the White Walkers, he would never have made it back alive. Will, who had never been robust to begin with, now looked like a shadow of his former self. His thin frame seemed barely able to support him, and half a bowl of porridge sat untouched on the table in front of him. He drank from it with trembling hands, his movements slow and unsteady. "The 7 bless you," he rasped. "If it weren't for you, I'd be dead." "What?" Aegor was confused. Will had survived because of his own resourcefulness. What did it have to do with him? "That day I was hiding in a tree. I saw Sir Waymar cut down by those creatures, those ghosts. I stayed in the tree for a long time after they left, too afraid to come down. When I finally did, I went to look for something I could take back as proof. But then Sir Waymar, he stood back up. His body was mangled, his wounds terrible, but his eyes, they were glowing blue. He reached out trying to strangle me. It was horrifying. If you hadn't told me to be careful of the dead, I'd never have reacted in time." Aegor was stunned. So that was how it had happened. The words he had spoken in desperation, almost as an afterthought, had saved Will's life. He had never imagined they would prove so crucial, but what was the point of calling him here now? He glanced around the room and noticed something on the table in front of the senior members of the Night's Watch. It was Waymar Royce's sword. The blade, once made of fine steel, was now shattered. Only the hilt, the tip of the sword, and a small portion of the base remained intact. The rest of the blade had been splintered into countless fragments as though struck by lightning. Despite his ordeal, Will had somehow managed to recover most of the pieces and bring them back to Castle Black after his long, harrowing journey. The shattered sword had been reassembled as best as it could, the pieces laid out like a puzzle. The breaks were clean, the fragments fitting together almost seamlessly, as if the weapon had been smashed all at once by some unimaginable force. This, Aegor realized, was powerful evidence. The sword's condition, coupled with Will's testimony, could turn things around for both of them. Take Will to rest, Benjen Stark, who had been sitting silently, finally spoke. Don't let him eat too much at once. A starving man doesn't know when he's full. Rest is what he needs most. Two black brothers helped Will to his feet and escorted him from the room. As he left, Will called out to Aegor, still asking how he had known about the dead rising again. Once the room was quiet again, Benjen gestured for Aegor to sit. What Will said aligns with what you and Gary reported, Commander Mormont began gravely. Judging by his condition, I don't think you three colluded to fabricate this story. Mormont's tone softened slightly. I now have reason to believe that there is indeed a strange and dangerous enemy north of the wall. Perhaps it's the White Walkers or something worse. It wasn't just Will's words that had swayed the leadership. During Aegor's confinement, the Night's Watch blacksmiths had conducted experiments, trying to replicate the damage to the shattered sword. No one had been able to mimic the effect, proving that Waymer's weapon had been destroyed by something beyond human capability. I'll be leaving for Winterfell soon, Benjen continued. You'll come with me, you'll report your experiences directly to the Lord of Winterfell. Bring Gary and Will as well along with the broken swords, prepare a clear and concise version of events. My brother will be busy with King Robert's arrival, so you'll need to make your case quickly. Maester Aemon nodded. Don't overthink it. You did well when reporting to us, just do the same when speaking to Eddard Stark. I understand, Aegor replied, suppressing the excitement rising within him. I'll prepare right away. Regardless of the reasons why Benjen originally joined the Night's Watch, Aegor had to admit that he was, without question, a dedicated chief ranger. The lean and hardened man had received word from a raven that the king was expected to arrive in the north within 3 weeks. Knowing that the journey from Castle Black to Winterfell would take no more than 2 weeks, Benjen busied himself for several days overseeing defense patrol arrangements before finally preparing to leave. Fortunately, Will had managed to return to the wall just in time to corroborate Aegor's story. This shifted Benjen's plans. He decided to take Aegor along to Winterfell to report to the Warden of the North. Aegor couldn't help but feel thankful that not everyone sought personal comfort the way he did. If it had been him in Benjen's place, receiving an invitation from a brother who happened to be the Lord of Winterfell, he would have packed his bags and headed south the same day. Compared to the wall, even Winterfell, known by Southerners for being cold and gloomy, seemed like paradise. Some people, Aegor thought, are so noble that their sense of duty is beyond the understanding of ordinary folk. He didn't presume to judge others by his own standards just because he couldn't relate to them. He genuinely admired Benjen's honor and commitment to his duty, but Aegor himself had no such ties. He wasn't born or raised in the North, and he didn't have a brother who ruled as the Warden of the North. To him, this land was as foreign as its customs. It felt akin to being conscripted into a war with no allegiance to either side, forced to swear oaths under the threat of mutilation, and expected to live and die for a cause he didn't believe in. He had no illusions about his own character. He wasn't noble or selfless, and no grandiose poetic oath could change that. Aegor simply couldn't accept such a fate. Even if he stripped away any personal motives, he believed that with his knowledge and understanding of the world, he could contribute far more elsewhere than by being confined to the wall, battling White Walkers until his dying breath. Opportunities, after all, came to those who were prepared. Will, who had witnessed Waymer's death firsthand from the safety of a tree, might have seemed like the more obvious choice to accompany Benjen to Winterfell. But the Chief Ranger had chosen Aegor without hesitation. Part of the reason was that Will was still too weak to make the journey, but more likely it was because Will wasn't presentable. Compared to the skittish poacher who stuttered and spoke with a thick accent, Aegor was articulate, clear-minded, and composed, qualities far more suitable for addressing the Lord of Winterfell. Besides, rumors were swirling that Will had been left deeply shaken, perhaps even mentally unhinged by his encounter with the White Walkers. They departed in the afternoon. To save time, they planned to take the King's Road, passing through the Wolfswood directly to Winterfell. They wouldn't stop at Last Hearth or Deepwood Motte. As with patrols beyond the wall, they carried enough provisions to sustain them, though for ease of travel they each brought 2 horses. Snow fell lightly from the sky as the two of them rode out through the gates of Castle Black. Though the road they followed was technically part of the King's Road, it bore little resemblance to the Grand Highway farther south. Here it was barely wider than a forest trail. The true King's Road began at King's Landing and ended at Winterfell. The northernmost stretch they rode on was little more than a nominal extension. They rode south in silence and soon approached Mole's Town. Cresting a gentle slope, Aegor couldn't resist glancing back. Castle Black stood on the southern side of the wall where its icy shadow did not fall. The wall itself, despite its immense height, didn't dominate daily life for the Night's Watch. It was easy enough to ignore its presence. Aegor, for one, had quickly learned to avoid craning his neck to look up at it, but no amount of willful ignorance could make the wall disappear. It stood there, towering and immutable, as if it had existed since the dawn of time and would endure until the end of the world. Now, as they moved farther away, the wall's full outline came into view. What had once loomed above him like an insurmountable barrier had become a distant gray-blue expanse stretching endlessly along the northern horizon. It extended east and west, fading into the cold mist until it disappeared entirely. From a distance, its scale was even more awe-inspiring. It was the largest structure ever built by man in this world, the tallest and most formidable creation in Westeros. The towers and barracks of the Night's Watch at its base seemed like mere children's toys scattered in the snow. The men in black patrolling below looked no larger than ants. In Aegor's old world, such a place would have been a prime tourist destination. Visitors would flock to it for a chance to marvel at its grandeur, to take a break from the chaos of city life, to bask in the quiet majesty of nature. People would stand atop the wall, gazing out at the vast haunted forest below, describing it as spiritual or soul-cleansing. It would have been a perfect retreat for urbanites desperate to escape the grind. But here, the existence of the White Walkers changed the wall's purpose entirely. It wasn't a tourist attraction, it was a last bastion, a military fortification standing against humanity's annihilation. It was the frontline of a war for survival. This trip to Winterfell, Aegor realized, might be his last chance to escape before the next patrol beyond the wall. If fate allowed, he hoped never to return. Aegor, Benjen's voice cut through his thoughts. You're a stranger here. I know you're resentful about being forced to serve on the wall, but let me give you some advice. Don't even think about running. Many have tried, and the cost of desertion is always heavy. I understand, Aegor replied quickly, alarmed that his thoughts had been so transparent. I've sworn a sacred oath. I'll fulfill my duty until the end of my life. Where I come from, the culture is different, but the value placed on keeping one's word is no less important. Good. Benjen nodded, letting the matter drop. My brother Eddard Stark is a practical man, very much a northerner. He doesn't care for excessive ceremony, but he's still the Warden of the North and Lord of Winterfell. The Stark bloodline is ancient and their legacy is long. There are certain courtesies and taboos you must observe when addressing him. I'll explain them to you now. Forgetting them won't cost you your head, but it would still be impolite. Understood, Aegor nodded earnestly. He cast one last look at the wall, his expression complicated, before turning his attention to Benjen's words. They traveled by day and rested by night, passing Mole's Town and the ruins of Queen's Crown. As they moved farther south, the land grew more populated. Though the Night's Watch was granted the gift, an expanse of land north of the Wolfswood, meant to provide taxes and resources to support the Watch, its population had dwindled over the years. Frequent wildling raids, coupled with the Watch's declining strength, had driven most of the gift's inhabitants south, seeking safety under the protection of northern lords. Now only a few villages near the Watch's strongholds remained. Ironically, the abandonment of the gift had made the north safer. The uninhabited land combined with the wall itself created a double barrier. Few wildlings were willing to risk crossing the wall and then starving in the desolate gift just to raid villages under the protection of houses like Umber or Karstark. With such raids becoming less profitable, fewer wildlings attempted them. Many northern lords credited the Night's Watch for this improvement, and they continued to provide food, clothing, and supplies to support the brothers in black. The journey to Winterfell was uneventful for Aegor and Benjen, save for a brief encounter with a group of wildlings fleeing south. Upon spotting the two men in black cloaks, the wildlings quickly retreated into the forest. Unlike Waymar, Benjen had no interest in pursuing them. He let them go without incident. As the road widened, they crossed a stone bridge spanning a swift river. Farms and settlements began to appear, clusters of homes forming around sturdy stone walls and timber beams. The road grew busier with travelers and merchants. Nights were no longer spent camping in the wilderness. 2 weeks later, as Benjen had predicted, they arrived at Winterfell. Winterfell is not a city but a castle. Its purpose, much like the Red Keep in King's Landing, is to serve as a fortress and provide shelter for its lord and his family. It lacks any urban functions and has no citizens in the traditional sense. According to legend, it was built by Brandon the Builder with the aid of giants. As a noble stronghold, Winterfell is undeniably impressive, but when compared to another structure said to have been built by the same man, the Wall, it pales in scale and grandeur. Excluding the surrounding villages and the winter town, which lay temporarily abandoned during the warmer months, the area enclosed by Winterfell's high stone walls spans less than 100 acres, with a portion of that space taken up by the Godswood. The permanent residents within the castle walls amount to only a few hundred, consisting mostly of followers, servants, and their families, all of whom serve the Stark household. Despite this, Winterfell commands the largest standing force in the north, second only to the Night's Watch. For someone like Aegor, who had stood watch on the wall and survived encounters with White Walkers in the haunted forest, there weren't many things in the world that could still inspire fear. When he first laid eyes on Winterfell, his initial reaction wasn't awe or admiration but surprise. This small place is the political center of the North and the home of so many key figures in this world's history. It was no wonder, he thought, that even the king constantly struggled to manage his realm. But the longer he considered it, the more Aegor found himself subconsciously comparing Winterfell to the Wall. And when placed next to that towering expanse of ice, nothing else in this world could truly be called big. It was late when Aegor and Benjen arrived at Winterfell. Aegor, lost in his thoughts, followed the chief ranger through the castle gates. "Welcome home, Lord Benjen," said a guard who had clearly served the Stark family for many years. Taking the reins of the ranger's horse, he continued, "I'll arrange accommodations and a bath for you right away." "No need for that," Benjen replied. "Where is my brother?" "My lord just finished receiving the king. He's likely still busy in the main keep now, but I can't say for sure." "The king is here already?" Benjen frowned. "Damn, I thought I'd arrived 2 days early. At least I didn't miss the dinner. Go on then, I'll find him myself." "Yes, my lord." Winterfell was teeming with activity. The large parade grounds were packed with horses, wagons, chests, and bustling servants. King Robert Baratheon had brought hundreds of escorts on his journey north, and Queen Cersei and Princess Miachella had brought even more luggage. With no room to house all the guests, many of them had been diverted to the nearby winter town for lodging. At the moment, the castle gates were a flurry of motion, with people constantly coming and going. Benjen led Aegor through the winding, uneven corridors of the castle, eventually reaching the main keep where the Stark family resided. After a brief exchange with the household staff, they entered and found Eddard Stark, the Lord of Winterfell, in his study. The Warden of the North was taking a brief respite from his duties, issuing instructions to servants regarding the arrangements for his royal guests. "Benjen," Eddard's face lit up with a genuine smile when he saw his younger brother. Standing, he waved the servants away before striding forward to embrace him. "How is life on the wall?" "Still as hard as ever." "I've grown used to it." Benjen returned the hug briefly before stepping back. "But there have been troubling events beyond the wall recently. I thought it necessary to bring this directly to the Warden of the North." "Yes, the wildlings, I've read your letters." Eddard sighed, running a hand through his dark brown hair. Though his long face resembled Benjen's, there was a gravity about him, a quiet authority befitting his role as lord. Even when he smiled, his demeanor was solemn and composed, a ruler through and through. To Aegor, he was the first person he'd met in this world who truly carried the bearing of a leader. "But you don't know how much trouble I've had dealing with Robert today. He's grown as fat as a pig." He gave his brother a wry smile but quickly added, "Can we talk after the welcome feast tonight? It's been an exhausting day." "No, we need to talk now," Benjen said, shaking his head. His tone was serious. "What I have to tell you is more important than the banquet, the king, the queen, or anything else." Eddard's expression darkened at his brother's tone. Putting aside his complaints, he turned to Aegor, who had been waiting silently by the door. "And who is this?" "This is one of my rangers. He will explain what happened," Benjen said, gesturing for Aegor to step forward. Eddard's sharp gray eyes studied Aegor. "Your name, friend?" "Your lordship may call me Aegor," he replied respectfully. "I'm not from Westeros, and I don't have a surname in the fashion of the Seven Kingdoms." "Not from Westeros?" Eddard's curiosity was piqued. He turned to Benjen, silently seeking an explanation. "Aegor comes from an unknown continent far west of Westeros," Benjen explained. "He encountered a White Walker while patrolling beyond the wall with Waymar Royce and managed to return to warn us." "White Walkers?" Eddard's face grew grim, his gaze shifting back to Aegor. It was clear he didn't believe in the existence of White Walkers. To him, Waymar's disappearance was more likely the result of a wildling ambush. Jon Royce, Waymar's father and a key vassal of Jon Arryn, had passed through Winterfell while escorting his son to the wall. During their meeting, Jon had made it clear he expected Eddard to look out for his son. Although it wasn't Eddard's responsibility as Lord of Winterfell to account for the fate of a Night's Watch ranger, the situation left him feeling uneasy, almost as if he had failed to honor his promise. "Wait a moment," Eddard said, his tone shifting to one of suspicion. "If I'm not mistaken, you were one of the 3 rangers Waymar took beyond the wall. If White Walkers killed your leader, why did they let you and the other man escape?" His voice hardened. "And according to the rules of the Night's Watch, what is the punishment for desertion?" "They didn't let us escape," Aegor replied calmly despite the growing tension. "We fled, barely surviving the ordeal, and as we neared the wall, the other ranger and I managed to kill one of the White Walkers that pursued us." "Where's the body?" "When White Walkers die, their bodies disintegrate, leaving no remains," Aegor explained. He knew this sounded unconvincing, so he quickly added, "But I've brought other evidence." "Show me," Eddard said, his skepticism evident. He exhaled lightly, gestured for Aegor to proceed, and sat at his desk. Aegor moved quickly, retrieving the items he had brought from Castle Black. Inside his pack were 3 broken swords, carefully wrapped in puncture-proof leather, as well as an obsidian dagger. He laid them out on the table, piecing together the shattered blades one by one. Waymar's sword in particular had been broken so thoroughly that it took several minutes to arrange. Eddard frowned as he watched, though he waited patiently for Aegor to finish before asking, 3 broken swords and a black dagger. What are they supposed to mean?" "The broken swords belonged to 3 rangers who fought against the White Walkers," Aegor explained steadily. "Waymar died in battle. Gary was gravely injured and remains in Castle Black recovering. I am the only one fortunate enough to have survived." He picked up the dagger, holding it out for Eddard to inspect. "And this is the obsidian weapon that killed one of the White Walkers." "So all 3 swords were broken during the fight?" Eddard asked, his brow furrowing. "How do I know they weren't just broken by you?" "Please examine the edges closely, your lordship," Aegor replied, gesturing to the shattered blades. "The damage is unlike anything caused by normal wear or combat." Eddard leaned closer, studying the pieces with a practiced eye. He had seen countless broken swords over the years, but none like these. Picking up a fragment of Waymar's blade, he tapped it against the table, confirming it was real steel. "What caused this?" he finally asked. "Ice," Aegor said simply. Or rather, the ice magic wielded by the White Walkers. Their weapons appear to be made of ice and they can shatter steel on contact. Aegor then recounted the events beyond the wall, refining the explanation he had given to Commander Mormont and Maester Eamon. This time he spoke with greater clarity and confidence, his body and mind fully recovered after days of rest. His explanation was precise, his tone measured, and his details persuasive. He described how the steel swords had shattered in moments against the White Walkers' weapons, then recounted the desperate escape back to the wall and the lucky blow that felled one of their pursuers. He omitted nothing essential, keeping his narrative clear and concise. Eddard listened in silence, his hand supporting his chin as his sharp gray eyes bore into Aegor. Once Aegor finished, Eddard lowered his hand, his thoughtful gaze shifting to his brother. Benjen observed Eddard carefully, sensing that his brother was still reluctant to fully accept the existence of White Walkers. But that hesitation was not surprising. Benjen himself had only second-hand reports to rely on, and while he trusted Aegor, he had no first-hand proof to offer. The Shadow Tower has also reported sightings of White Walkers, Benjen said, making one last effort. And Castle Black's rangers as well as those from Eastwatch have witnessed signs of wildlings migrating in massive numbers. Villages north of the wall are being abandoned, their people fleeing something. His voice grew more insistent. All signs point to a new and deadly threat gathering in the far north, and you know the state of the Night's Watch. We're stretched thin and struggling to hold the wall as it is. We need aid, and we need it now. Eddard exhaled deeply. I'll inform my men to let you take prisoners from the dungeons, he said after a moment, his tone cool. What the Night's Watch needs now is not just a handful of criminals or untrained recruits. Benjen interrupted, his voice sharp. Do you expect a band of barely disciplined convicts to defend the Seven Kingdoms? They're barely capable of maintaining order during peaceful times, let alone against the current dangers. He stepped forward, his frustration clear. I didn't bring Aegor here to repeat the same tired requests as other brothers of the Watch. This is bigger than that. Silence filled the room as Benjen's words hung in the air. Eddard sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the obsidian dagger in his hand. He turned it over slowly, his brow furrowed in thought. In Aegor's original world, the trajectory of civilization followed a spiral of progress. Although there were moments of stagnation and regression, the general trend was one of upward development. But here in Westeros, the situation was different. Social advancement depended on productivity, which in turn relied heavily on population in an era of limited technological development. But feeding a population required resources, and the irregular, punishing climate of this world made resources scarce. The constant wars fought over these limited resources only worsened the problem, further destabilizing production. During a long summer, civilization might find a moment to flourish, but even a slightly extended winter could send it spiraling backward. This created a vicious cycle. Humanity needed people to advance, but the fragility of life made progress painfully slow. Stagnation and underdevelopment made further progress even harder to achieve. In this context, it wasn't surprising that Westeros's level of social development lagged so far behind its ancient history. Aegor wasn't entirely sure how much of the tens of thousands of years of history from the Dawn Age was factual, but he knew one thing. In this feudal society, especially in the sparsely populated north, armies couldn't be mobilized quickly. I'll contact the lords and request that they each send a few hundred men in proportion to their population to support the wall, Eddard Stark said at last, sighing deeply. Despite his brother's earlier harshness, Eddard did not take offense. He knew Benjen's bluntness came from concern, not disrespect. Shaking his head, he added, but it's the height of the farming season, so don't expect me to raise significant numbers quickly. However, give me a detailed list of supplies and I'll see what I can provide. As for the king, give me some time, I'll speak to him myself. Eddard leaned back in his chair, his face shadowed with worry. When I spoke with Robert in the crypt earlier, I mentioned the wall's need for support. Unfortunately, he's preoccupied. Tensions in King's Landing have him on edge and he's come here looking for my help. He's in no position to worry about the wall right now. If the wall falls, Benjen said bluntly, the North will be the first to suffer. Even if you help Robert stabilize King's Landing, it won't matter. Think about the consequences. Benjen's tone softened slightly as he continued. We don't urgently need conventional supplies right now. Those can be arranged over time, but there is one thing we do need, obsidian. Author's note. The wall holds more than ice and stone, it holds inevitability. Aegor carries proof, but proof does not mean safety. In Westeros, foresight is a burden few survive. And not just a small amount. The Night's Watch requires a large stockpile and quickly. Unfortunately, obsidian is rare and expensive, mostly sold as decorative pieces in the market. We need it as a weapon, not an ornament. I read somewhere that Dragonstone has massive reserves of obsidian, Aegor interjected. If we could arrange to mine it, it would be more than enough for our needs. Eddard nodded thoughtfully but remained skeptical of the Night's Watch's claims about obsidian's effectiveness against White Walkers. Still, he had already refused so many requests that he felt obligated to act. I'll write to Stannis about this, perhaps he can help arrange something. Eddard turned his gaze to the window where the dim light of evening was settling over Winterfell. It's getting late, you two should bathe and change for the dinner. Robert is an old friend, yes, but he is also the king. If you're too casual in his presence, even if he doesn't mind, it might give others an excuse to criticize him or me. Benjen nodded and the two Night's Watchmen excused themselves. As they left the room, Aegor followed Benjen through the winding corridors of the castle. Despite his allegiance to the Night's Watch, Benjen was still a Stark, and the room he had grown up in as a child remained his to use. To Aegor's surprise, Benjen had also arranged for him to have a small room in Winterfell. Given how crowded the castle was, Aegor would have expected someone of his rank, a lowly ranger of the Night's Watch, to be assigned to a bunk bed in one of the inns outside the castle walls. That he had been given accommodation within Winterfell itself felt more like a precaution against him escaping than a privilege. As these thoughts churned in his mind, Aegor and Benjen turned a corner and encountered a young man heading straight toward them. "Uncle Benjen, Jon." Benjen smiled, his expression softening into something almost paternal. "You've grown taller again." The young man was lean, with a long face and dark brown hair that matched Benjen's. Aegor didn't immediately recognize him. The boy looked different from his depiction in the show. But the tone of their conversation gave it away. This was Jon Snow, the bastard of Eddard Stark. Of course, Aegor knew Jon's true parentage. He was the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. As significant as Jon's identity was, something else captured Aegor's attention: the small, snow-white direwolf standing by Jon's side. Its crimson eyes gazed up at him, curious but not hostile. "What the hell is going on?" Aegor thought, his mind racing. "Because of me, the deserters who would have been executed at the start of the original story, Gary and Will, never crossed the wall. That means the Starks wouldn't have encountered the dead direwolf and her pups on their way back from the execution ground. So how did this damn little direwolf end up with Jon Snow?" "If I'm not mistaken," Benjen said, noticing the wolf, "this little fellow is a direwolf. They don't come south of the wall. Where did it come from?" "The villagers found its mother dead on a path outside Winterfell," Jon replied. "Jory went to investigate and brought back a litter of 6 pups." The uncle and nephew spoke casually, but Aegor was reeling. The sight of the direwolf made him question everything he thought he understood. The wolf's presence meant one of two things: either his actions had less influence on this world's events than he thought, or some larger force was actively working to maintain the story's original trajectory. While the pup at Jon's side was small and unassuming, its very existence unnerved Aegor. The more he thought about it, the more he began to question whether his attempts to change the future of this world were truly within his control. Sure, he had made small changes. Gary was still alive and Will had survived, but these were minor characters, nobodies in the grand scheme of things. Whether they lived or died had little impact on the broader narrative of Westeros. But what about Benjen Stark? Benjen was a significant figure, one of the key players in the early events of the story. If some unseen force was working to preserve the original timeline, was Benjen doomed to meet the same fate during his next ranging mission, turning into a half-dead servant of the White Walkers? And if that was the case, what were Aegor's chances of surviving the mission himself? The more he thought about it, the worse his outlook seemed. If this world truly operated under some predestined narrative, his very presence, an outsider who had already altered events, might make him a target. "I need to find a way out," he thought grimly. "What are you daydreaming about? Let's go." Benjen's voice pulled him back to reality. The chief ranger clapped him on the shoulder, gesturing for him to follow. "Take a bath and change your clothes. You'll need to be ready for the dinner." "I'm joining too?" Aegor asked, surprised. "Of course, there are only 2 of us here in Winterfell right now," Benjen said with a faint smile. "Even if the whole Night's Watch were here, they'd still be treated as honored guests. Enjoy it while you can. Only in the north does the Night's Watch still get the respect it deserves." After drying himself off, Aegor picked up the clothes left by the servants. They were the characteristic all-black of the Night's Watch, but these were made of velvet, clearly not the standard-issue uniforms of the wall. The texture and workmanship were leagues above the coarse, practical clothing typically worn by the brothers. When he slipped them on and the soft fabric brushed against his skin, the sensation was so luxurious that he nearly sighed aloud. They weren't tailored for him, though. Judging by the size, they were likely brought along by Benjen Stark. Traveling on official business with a leader certainly has its perks, Aegor thought with a wry smile. It wasn't as though he had never worn fine clothes before. Back in his previous life, his family hadn't been wealthy, but they were comfortable. They had a home, a car, and his mother owned a small clothing store. She was a skilled tailor, and growing up he'd taken good clothes for granted. Anything he pulled out of his wardrobe was well made and affordable. But that life felt like it belonged to another person, another era. Now, having struggled just to survive in this world, the simple comfort of good clothing felt like a luxury. Among the countless transmigrators in fiction, he thought bitterly, he must surely rank among the most pitiful. Winterfell, warmed by its underground hot springs, circulated heat through its walls. Even in a room without a fireplace, the temperature was comfortably higher than the freezing outdoors. After his bath, Aegor relaxed in a chair, the heat lulling him into a rare sense of ease. For a brief moment, he didn't want to move a finger, but the evening's obligations called, pulling himself together. He dressed and left the room. The Night's Watch, though formally treated as honored guests at Winterfell, were far from being the center of attention. With the king's entourage present, Aegor was little more than an afterthought. Following the brisk instructions of the servants, he made his way to the banquet hall and found his assigned seat at a table tucked into a far corner. The hall was alive with activity. The savory aroma of roasted meat and freshly baked bread filled the air. Banners from various houses adorned the gray stone walls, the direwolf of House Stark, the crowned stag of House Baratheon, and the roaring lion of House Lannister. A singer played the harp, his voice weaving a ballad that Aegor could barely make out over the din, partly because of his shaky grasp of the common tongue, and partly because he was seated at the far end of the hall. Jon Snow sat at the same table as Aegor. As a bastard, Jon's social standing at the king's dinner was not much better than that of a night's watchman. Whether his father was Rhaegar Targaryen or Eddard Stark, Jon was still illegitimate in the eyes of Westerosi society. Like Aegor, his inclusion at the banquet was purely ceremonial. He was allowed to sit, but only at the lowest tier of the hierarchy. Such was the cold reality of the feudal world, yet Jon didn't seem troubled by his status. He appeared relaxed, sometimes sneaking pieces of food to the direwolf pup hiding beneath the table, other times eagerly peppering Aegor with questions about the night's watch. His youthful enthusiasm and optimism were almost enviable. Their table was shared by other young servants and attendants. Some served House Stark, others the royal family, and still others came from Lannisport or Casterly Rock. Despite their differing allegiances, these boys shared no deep-seated feuds or grudges. They sat shoulder to shoulder, sipping fine wine and swapping stories in easy camaraderie. Jon's interest in the night's watch seemed infectious. As Aegor answered his questions, more and more of their tablemates began to lean in, setting aside their utensils and cups to listen. Do giants really exist? Do the people north of the wall actually sleep with goats? I heard the wildlings eat their own children when food runs out. Aegor chose his words carefully. He avoided mentioning White Walkers, knowing that such claims would only earn him ridicule. Instead, he picked out the more colorful and entertaining stories from his time at the wall, turning them into lively conversation starters. Although Aegor was in his 20s, his youthful appearance helped him blend in easily with the teenagers around him. At the same time, his age and experiences gave him a quiet maturity that the others instinctively respected. Back in his previous life, he hadn't been particularly smooth-talking or charismatic. But here, in this world where strength and bloodlines dominated social standing, his knowledge and demeanor made him seem almost worldly by comparison. Drawing on bits of pop psychology he had read before crossing over, he found it easy to endear himself to the group. Within a short time, Aegor had become the center of attention at his table. The boys surrounded him, raising their cups and toasts and peppering him with questions. Even those seated at neighboring tables began shifting their benches closer to listen in on his stories. Things aren't peaceful at the wall these days, Aegor said after regaling them with enough amusing anecdotes to loosen their tongues and win their trust. He let his voice grow more serious, steering the conversation toward a topic that mattered. The weather is growing colder by the day. 100,000 wildlings, led by the king beyond the wall, are gathering to breach the wall and head south. To them, the wall is the dividing line between life and death. Crossing it is their only chance of surviving the winter. And that's not all. Rangers have reported sightings of strange humanoid creatures in the haunted forest, figures that match the old stories of White Walkers. This year, several brothers have gone missing while patrolling north. The boys listened with wide eyes, some visibly skeptical, others nervously amazed. Though his words were aimed at them, Aegor's true intention lay elsewhere. He knew these boys had no real power, but behind every servant stood a knight or lord. Jon Snow was close to the Starks, and the young attendants of other houses served those who controlled the resources of Westeros. By spreading word of the Night's Watch's plight through these channels, Aegor hoped to plant seeds of support that might eventually reach the ears of those in power. The leaders of the Night's Watch were capable men, but they were constrained by their era. Raised in a world where swords decided disputes and the written word was secondary, they had little grasp of the concept of public opinion. Aegor, with his outsider's perspective, saw the potential to use it to benefit the Watch and by extension himself. After all, in this brutal world, survival often depended on collective strength. If the Night's Watch grew stronger, his chances of living through his time on the wall would grow with it. 100,000 wildlings, one boy repeated, incredulous. Others exchanged nervous glances. Can the Night's Watch stop them? That's a good question, Aegor replied, grimacing as he drank the last of his wine. The truth is, not all of those 100,000 are soldiers. There are children, the elderly, families traveling with livestock. At most there are 10,000 who can fight. But the problem isn't their strength, it's our weakness. The wall is massive and the Watch doesn't have enough men to defend it all. If the wildlings choose to cross at an unguarded stretch, they could attack from inside and out. It would stretch us to the breaking point. What will you do then? Another boy asked, his voice tinged with unease. Aegor smiled bitterly. That's exactly what the Chief Ranger came to discuss with the Warden of the North. The boys began firing more questions at him, but their chatter abruptly quieted when the true stars of the banquet began to arrive. The noise in the hall quickly faded, and all eyes turned to the entrance as the guard escorted the queen into the hall. Before crossing into this world, Aegor had come across a saying. The Game of Thrones production team had limited funds and couldn't afford actors who combined youth, beauty, and acting skill, so they prioritized the latter. The result was that many characters in the series appeared older or less attractive than described in the books, while some supporting roles turned out stunningly beautiful. Seeing the queen in person, Aegor couldn't help but feel this sentiment confirmed. The woman before him was far younger and more radiant than the Cersei he had seen on TV. She exuded charm and grace. Her long golden hair shining under the light. A gem-studded crown rested on her head, complementing her bright blue eyes with emerald inlays. She wore an innocent smile as she entered, not sparing a glance for the northern guard beside her. If one didn't already know the depths of her scheming nature, who could imagine such a beautiful exterior concealed a heart as ruthless and venomous as hers? Following closely behind was the king, arm in arm with Lady Stark, who also appeared much younger than her on-screen counterpart. The king had the ruddy complexion and thick beard Aegor had expected, but he was far taller than imagined, a towering figure of both fat and muscle. Next came the Stark and Baratheon children. Aegor barely spared them a glance. They looked somewhat different from their depictions in the show, but he wasn't inclined to spend time identifying each one. With everyone distracted by the arrivals, he finally had the chance to sample the fish on the table. Since acquiring the obsidian dagger that had saved his life, he hadn't had the opportunity to eat anything better than the bland rations served in the Night's Watch canteen. The two Lannister brothers followed the children. Jaime Lannister entered in striking contrast to the others. Tall, handsome, and imposing, he wore a red silk tunic, black high boots, and a satin cloak draped over his shoulders. He carried himself with such regal confidence that he looked more like a king than the man at the head of the hall. The dwarf walking beside him, however, was the one who truly caught Aegor's attention. Tyrion Lannister was unmistakable. Among the characters in this world, he was one of the few Aegor could identify without the aid of costumes or house sigils. It wasn't just his stature that made him stand out, it was the intelligence and wit lurking behind his sharp features. This man, Aegor thought, is probably the most worth befriending in the entire story of Game of Thrones. If he could get close to Tyrion, perhaps there was a way to escape the Night's Watch without risking desertion or execution. The dwarf had connections, influence, and a pragmatic mind. But as quickly as the idea came, reality reasserted itself. Aegor was just a lowly ranger. How could someone like him approach a Lannister, let alone forge a relationship? Lost in thought, he watched as the Lannister brothers passed by, heading for the more prominent seats reserved for their family. The final arrivals were Benjen Stark and Theon Greyjoy, the young ward of the Lord of Winterfell. After they took their seats, the hall erupted in a flurry of toasts and polite congratulations, and the feast officially began. Jon Snow and the younger servants at the table still wanted to hear more of Aegor's tales about patrolling the wall and encountering wildlings, but Aegor had grown disinterested. "I've told enough of my stories," he said, deflecting their attention. "How about you tell me yours? I've never been south of the Neck since coming to Westeros. Who can introduce me to life in the south?" The good thing about spending time with this group of youthful, relatively innocent boys was how quickly they warmed up after a few drinks. Under the influence of wine, one of the Lannister servants launched into a dramatic tale of accompanying his knight on a wild adventure outside King's Landing. Beneath the table, Jon's direwolf pup gnawed contentedly on a bone, oblivious to the lively chatter above. On stage, Jon listened intently to the other boys as they swapped tales of war, hunts, and scandalous escapades. Aegor, however, had already drifted into his own thoughts. "Jon, how are you tonight?" a familiar voice interrupted. Benjen had left his seat to check on his neglected nephew. "Very well," Jon replied brightly. "Uncle, I heard from Aegor that the Night's Watch is in desperate need of men. When you leave, take me with you." The servant who had been recounting his daring exploits fell silent, scooting aside to make room for Benjen. The chief ranger sat down, took Jon's glass and examined it. "Summer wine," he said after a sip. "Nothing tastes as sweet. How many glasses have you had tonight, Jon?" "I'm not drunk," Jon replied quickly. "I never said you were," Benjen said with a slight smile, setting the glass down. He glanced toward the high table where his brothers sat before turning back to his nephew. "To be honest, the wall does need young men like you right now." Jon's face lit up with pride. "I'm a better swordsman than anyone I've ever trained with. Hullen says I'm one of the best riders in Winterfell." "Good, you agree?" Jon said, excitement creeping into his voice. "If you tell father, I know he'll agree too." Benjen's gaze shifted to Aegor, who shrugged, silently assuring him he hadn't encouraged Jon in this. Turning back to Jon, Benjen said carefully, "Jon, the wall is a hard place for a boy." "I'm almost a man," Jon countered. "I'll be 15 on my next name day. Maester Lewin says bastards grow up faster than trueborn children." "That's true," Benjen conceded with a small smile. He poured himself more wine and drank deeply. "Daeron Targaryen was only 14 when he conquered Dorne," Jon added confidently. Benjen shook his head. "That campaign lasted an entire summer, and Daeron lost 10,000 men to conquer Dorne and another 50,000 to hold it. Someone should have told him that war is no game. And let's not forget, Daeron Targaryen died at 18. You haven't forgotten that part, have you?" "I haven't," Jon said, his cheeks reddening whether from embarrassment or the wine. Straightening his back, he lifted his chin. "Uncle, I've made up my mind. I want to serve in the Night's Watch." The table fell silent. Some of the boys, envious of Aegor's adventurous tales, had daydreamed about joining the Watch themselves, but none had made a decision as serious as Jon's. Most of the servants, though of modest birth, were still legitimate heirs to their families. Jon, on the other hand, seemed increasingly alienated from his siblings as he grew older, leaving him without a place to belong. Benjen smiled faintly. Jon, you must understand, the Night's Watch is for men who have no ties to family. We take no wives, father no children. Our duty is our wife and honor our mistress. A bastard has no honor, Jon said firmly. I'm ready to take the oath. You're only 14, Benjen replied gently. Before you've been with a woman, you can't truly understand what you're giving up. I don't care about women, Jon snapped, his frustration boiling over. If you knew you might care, Benjen said kindly. If you truly understood what the oath costs, you wouldn't be so eager to take it. I'm not your child, Jon shouted. It's a pity you're not, Benjen said, rising from the bench. He patted Jon's shoulder. Come back to me after you've fathered a few bastards of your own, then we'll talk. I'll never father a bastard. Jon's eyes burned with anger as he spat the words. He didn't seem to notice the hall falling silent around him. His voice, steady and filled with resolve, carried across the room. Never, everyone stared at Jon, the tension thick in the air. With tears threatening to spill from his eyes, Jon stood abruptly. Excuse me, he said stiffly. Then before anyone could stop him, he turned and stormed out of the hall. On his way out, he collided with a serving girl, knocking over a bottle of wine. Laughter erupted in his wake, but Jon didn't look back. He shoved aside a yellow-robed servant who tried to help him and disappeared into the night, the direwolf pup close on his heels. Aegor sighed, almost covering his face in frustration. He finally understood what it meant to be naive. Here he was, racking his brain for ways to escape the Night's Watch, while a boy barely old enough to shave was clamoring to join. Benjen's gentle warnings had been clear enough. He had tried to tell Jon that joining the Watch meant sacrificing everything for a lonely life of service. But Jon, too young and idealistic, had taken his uncle's words as a slight, an insult to his pride. You're embarrassing yourself, Jon, Aegor thought with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. Still, a flicker of guilt tugged at him. He suddenly remembered something and stood up. I'll go check on him. Leave him be, Benjen said, waving dismissively. Let him cool off, but after a moment of hesitation, the chief ranger changed his mind. Forget it, go on then, just make sure the drunken fool doesn't hurt himself. Aegor left the music and dancing behind as he stepped out into the courtyard. The cold wind hit his face and the quiet of the night settled over him. The guards on the battlements above tightened their cloaks against the chill, their forms barely visible in the dim light. He scanned the area and quickly spotted Jon's figure walking alone. Boy, an unfamiliar voice called out. Aegor couldn't immediately see the speaker, but he knew his memory hadn't failed him. This was the right spot. Is that thing with you a wolf? It's a direwolf. His name is Ghost, Jon replied, turning toward the voice. He wiped at his face hastily, clearly not wanting anyone to see his tears. When he spotted Aegor stepping outside, Jon quickly turned away. What are you doing out here? Shouldn't you be inside at the dinner? Aegor moved around a stone pillar near the door and followed Jon's gaze, finally spotting the speaker. Tyrion Lannister was sitting on a protruding ledge above the hall's front entrance, gazing down at them. The dwarf was so still he might have passed for a statue if he hadn't spoken. It's too hot and too noisy in there, and I've had too much wine, Tyrion said with a shrug. I learned long ago it's impolite to vomit on one's brother. May I take a closer look at your wolf? Jon hesitated, then nodded slowly. Can you get down from there on your own, or should I fetch a ladder? A ladder? Tyrion scoffed, his tone mocking but good-natured. What do you take me for? With that, he leaned back, flipped into the air, and landed lightly on his hands before springing upright in a nimble backflip. The direwolf flinched, taking a few cautious steps back, and even Aegor had to admit that Tyrion's agility was impressive, especially given his stature. Dusting himself off with a laugh, Tyrion said, I think I may have startled your little wolf, my apologies. He's not frightened, Jon replied quickly, kneeling to beckon the wolf. Ghost, come here, come on boy. The direwolf padded over to Jon, nuzzling his cheek affectionately but keeping wary red eyes on Tyrion. When the dwarf extended a hand to pet him, Ghost bared his teeth in a silent growl, pulling back slightly. Not exactly friendly is he, Tyrion remarked dryly. Ghost, sit, Jon commanded firmly. The direwolf obeyed, lowering himself to the ground. Stay, he glanced up at Tyrion. You can touch him now, he won't move unless I say so, I'm training him. I see. Tyrion crouched and tentatively reached out, scratching behind the direwolf's ears. Good boy, he murmured. Aegor stood nearby, searching for a way to interrupt and draw the dwarf's attention without appearing rude. He saw his chance when Tyrion stopped speaking, momentarily focused on stroking Ghost's snowy fur. Jon, Aegor began, I don't know if I can call you that, but I must tell you, your uncle doesn't want you to join the Watch. He's doing it for your own good. For my own good, Jon's anger flared again. If he cared about my good, he wouldn't have let me be born at all. Ah, Tyrion said, tilting his head as understanding dawned. He straightened, his sharp eyes studying Jon. So you're Ned Stark's bastard, you want to join the Night's Watch, but Benjen Stark has refused. Tyrion's quick deduction was spot on, and the accuracy of his words only worsened Jon's mood. The boy's jaw tightened and he stood abruptly. Ghost pulled back from Tyrion at the same time, clearly sensing his master's agitation. If I offended you, I apologize, Tyrion said quickly, his voice measured. But why isn't the Wall a place that values ability over birth? A good place to put bastards. When you've seen 100,000 wildlings camp beneath tents preparing to attack the wall, giants that can tear a man in half with their bare hands, or pale white walkers cutting down your comrades with ice blades, when you've seen the dead rise again to kill the living, then you'll stop thinking it's a good place. An intriguing introduction, Tyrion replied with a faint smile. Author's note. Choices ripple farther than we imagine, yet some currents of fate remain unbroken. Aegor sees the threads he can tug, but the story of Westeros pulls just as hard in return. Even the smallest direwolf can remind us how little control we truly hold. Turning to Aegor, he added, "First of all, let me say that I respect the Night's Watch and admire your sacrifices to defend the kingdom. Truly I do. Although I'll never take your oath myself, I can appreciate your dedication." The dwarf's expression grew thoughtful. "That said, I don't believe in those old stories, giants, white walkers, myths, nothing more. The wildlings are no different from us, save for the fact that they happen to end up on the wrong side of the wall." "Have you ever seen the wall, Lord Tyrion?" Aegor asked, seizing the opportunity to steer the conversation. "It is the greatest structure ever built by men. A fact universally acknowledged," Tyrion said with a shrug. "Not only the largest, but also the most useless." "The most useless building?" Aegor resisted the urge to scoff. While Tyrion seemed approachable and intelligent, the vast gulf between their social statuses made him cautious. He couldn't afford to offend a Lannister, especially not on their first meeting. "My lord, do you know how large the wall truly is?" Tyrion raised an eyebrow, intrigued. 100 leagues long, 700 feet high, and wide enough at the top for 12 armored knights to ride side by side. As for its width, I'm afraid I don't know. Aegor nodded approvingly. "Your information is correct, but I doubt you've ever seen a structure 700 feet tall or a wall 100 leagues long. The towers of Old Town may be tall, but they're nothing compared to the wall. If you ever have the chance, you should see it for yourself. If not, I can offer you a clearer perspective." He continued, his voice calm but deliberate. "The wall is 700 feet high and roughly 70 feet wide, about 1/10 its height. By comparison, Winterfell's inner wall is 100 feet tall and 10 feet thick. Now, my lord, you're a clever man. Can you calculate what that means in terms of materials?" Tyrion frowned thoughtfully, clearly not accustomed to being stumped. After a moment he said, "It means the wall requires 7 times the height and 7 times the thickness of Winterfell's wall. That's 49 times the materials." "Exactly." Aegor allowed a small, respectful smile. "Now consider this, the wall is 100 leagues long. If we dismantled it and rebuilt it to match the height and thickness of Winterfell's walls, the wall would stretch for 5,000 leagues. That's enough to surround the north or separate the entire Kingsroad from King's Landing to Winterfell. Its weight exceeds the combined walls of every city in Westeros." "But the wall is made of ice," Tyrion countered. "Winterfell's walls are stone." "The weight of the same volume of stone is about twice that of ice," Aegor explained. "But considering the difference in construction difficulty, and the workload required to build a wall that's 700 feet high versus one that's 100 feet high, I'd say it balances out." He quickly brought the discussion back to his intended point. "Just now, my lord, you said that the only difference between the wildlings and us is that they ended up on the north side of the wall. I agree. Borrowing your logic, could I not also say that the difference between northerners and southerners is merely that they live on opposite sides of the neck? Most people in the north have the blood of our ancestors flowing in their veins," Jon interrupted, his earlier grievance forgotten as he latched onto the conversation. He had been silent for a long time, feeling somewhat out of his depth, but now he seized the opportunity to speak. "The First Men refers to the humans who first arrived in Westeros," Tyrion corrected patiently. "They are not a separate race, nor are they older than anyone else in a meaningful sense. From a racial perspective, the First Men are quite similar to the Andals or the Rhoynar with no fundamental differences. So the blood of the First Men isn't particularly significant, it's more of a cultural heritage and belief than an actual bloodline." "I agree," Aegor chimed in, nodding. "Lord Tyrion, I've read that the wall wasn't built in a single generation. 8,000 years ago, Brandon the Builder only laid the stone foundations of Winterfell and began the wall. Its current height of 700 feet was achieved over decades, possibly centuries, as thousands of Night's Watch craftsmen gradually piled up enormous blocks of ice cut from the haunted forest's frozen lakes. Isn't the wall made entirely of ice?" Tyrion raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "I must have skimmed that part of the histories, though it does make sense. It matters little what it's made of," Aegor said with a dismissive wave. "I'm no military strategist, but even I can see that if a fortification of that size were built along the neck, the southern lords wouldn't pose any threat to the north. But instead, the builders chose to erect it at the northernmost edge of the realm. Even if the first generation of wall builders had lost their minds, what compelled their descendants to continue expanding and maintaining the structure for thousands of years? Are we to believe every single one of them was insane, or is there another explanation?" Tyrion murmured thoughtfully, stroking his chin. "And another thing," Aegor continued, pressing his point while he had the dwarf's attention. "At the peak of its strength, the Night's Watch stationed more than 5,000 soldiers at Castle Black alone, with over 10,000 combat-ready troops in the entire legion, not even counting the servants and attendants. This was 8,000 years ago, when the population on both sides of the wall was far smaller than it is today. The wildlings' numbers at the time may not even have matched the watches. So, why did the North devote such immense resources to building and maintaining the wall while also supporting such a large standing army to guard it? Fear, Aegor concluded, his tone grave. The greatest fortifications and standing armies were built to confront the most terrifying of enemies. It was fear that drove our ancestors thousands of years ago to construct walls as high as these and to sustain an army of over 10,000 men, soldiers who neither produced anything nor were mobilized for daily affairs. There is no other reasonable explanation. Well, you make a valid point, Tyrion admitted candidly. But forgive me for being insistent, I simply cannot believe in the existence of legendary monsters until I see one with my own eyes. It's your right not to believe, Aegor said with a shrug, clearly unbothered. He wasn't trying to convince Tyrion of the existence of the White Walkers. In truth, I didn't believe it myself until the day I faced a White Walker in battle. I watched as it shattered the steel sword in my hand with its ice blade as if the sword were made of fragile glass. Until just now I thought you were merely the Night's Watch's accountant. How does someone like you end up fighting White Walkers? Tyrion asked curiously. Are you a ranger or do you hold some other post? Ranger, Aegor replied, nodding. Then his gaze shifted to Jon. Young man, do you want to know why your uncle doesn't support you joining the Night's Watch? Come with me and see the steel sword that was shattered by the White Walker. You'll soon understand how utterly powerless swordsmanship and skills are against such an enemy. Without hesitation, Jon followed Aegor, curiosity written across his face. Tyrion hesitated for a moment but eventually trailed behind them. Aegor felt a small sense of relief. His real intention wasn't just to show Jon the broken blade, but to find a pretext to get closer to Tyrion and discuss a matter of interest. Aegor led them to the room Benjen had arranged for them. Inside, the Night's Watchman presented the evidence he had brought back from the wall to Winterfell, which was meant to be shown to Eddard Stark in a plea for aid. He laid it all out on a small wooden table for his two guests to examine. The sword that belonged to Waymar Royce was more severely damaged, so it was left to your father Lord Benjen to be passed on to the victim's family, the Earl of Runestone, Aegor explained as he placed several broken swords on the table. The ones you see here belong to me and my comrade, Gary. Tyrion raised an eyebrow. The version I heard was that Waymar Royce went missing on patrol and is confirmed dead. I saw him fighting the White Walkers with my own eyes, Aegor lied, his expression calm. In truth, he had only heard about it, but the fact remained Waymar was dead. Originally my fellow ranger and I were destined to die as well, but a dragonglass dagger saved our lives. That black shard you see there, I made it myself. If you're curious, you can place the broken swords together and take a closer look. Not many people get to see a steel blade frozen and cracked by ice magic. Jon, being young and eager, quickly leaned in to inspect the shards. Tyrion, on the other hand, showed little interest in broken weapons. With his hands clasped behind his back, he strolled leisurely around the room. Not spotting any wine jugs or goblets, he returned to Aegor and looked up at him. Your name is Aegor. Aegor what? Aegor chuckled inwardly, relieved at the chance to keep the conversation going. That's not my real name, it's just a nickname given to me by some Westerosi farmers. I don't even know what it means. He gave a self-deprecating smile. I don't have a proper surname like most people. Where I come from, names are a little different. I thought you looked a bit different. You're not from Westeros. Where are you from? Essos, the Summer Isles. Surely not Sothorios, Tyrion speculated. None of those, Aegor replied. I come from a land your people call Tsina, a continent far west beyond the Sunset Sea. In my language, Tsina means Middle-earth. For thousands of years, we've believed our land is the center of the world, surrounded by nothing but endless ocean and scattered islands. Tsina, Tyrion's initial intent was to indulge his curiosity about the Night's Watchman, but Aegor's unexpected answer piqued his interest. I've never heard of this place. How did you come to Westeros and end up as a Night's Watchman? That's a long story, Aegor said, sensing that things were progressing smoothly. Tyrion was clearly hooked. Now Aegor needed to steer the conversation carefully. Our scholars studied the stars, made calculations, and reached a conclusion. The world is a sphere. They theorized that if a ship sailed far enough in one direction, it would eventually return to the starting point. To prove this, the ruler of Tsina ordered a fleet to undertake long-distance exploration. We built several sturdy steel ships and sent them sailing north, south, east, and west. Steel ships. That's impossible, Tyrion interrupted, his brow furrowed in disbelief. Does an iron bowl sink when placed in water? Aegor countered. A steel ship works on the same principle. What determines whether a ship floats is displacement, not the material it's made from. Tsina's technology is far ahead of Westeros'. I could explain it in detail if you're interested. Iron bowls, displacement, Tyrion muttered, his sharp mind quickly grasping the concept. But soon another question arose. Still, how do you build an iron bowl large enough to carry people? Wouldn't it sink the moment there's a leak? We use a technique called welding, Aegor explained. It melts the joints between steel plates, fusing them into a single piece. I'm not an expert, so I can't give you the finer details, but that's the general idea. Fascinating, Tyrion admitted, his mind clearly racing as he visualized the process. All right, go on with your story. As a known adventurer, I couldn't resist joining such an extraordinary expedition. After donating a considerable amount of money to the project, I secured a cabin on one of the ships and set sail with the fleet heading east. After several months at sea, we finally reached Westeros. I haven't heard of any foreign ships landing on the Sunset Sea. Where's your ship now? Tyrion asked. It sank, Aegor admitted with a rueful sigh. We encountered a storm while searching for a place to land. Although our steel ship was designed to withstand storms, a monstrous wave hurled it onto a reef. As you suspected, steel ships are strong but sink faster than anything once breached. I was lucky to survive as I happened to be on deck admiring the waves. After drifting for several days, I eventually made it ashore. And after that, Tyrion pressed, have the Northerners gone mad arresting every stray foreigner and sending them to the wall? I was starving when I reached land. The first thing I did was search for food. Unfortunately, I came across a village where no one understood me and refused to help. Left with no choice, I decided to take what I needed. Clearly, theft isn't my strong suit. I was caught almost immediately. Aegor gave a self-mocking laugh. The magistrate gave me a choice, lose a hand or take the black, so here I am. You mean to say, Tyrion's eyes widened in disbelief, you're the first man from Cena to reach Westeros and you ended up as a conscript of the Night's Watch? That's one way to put it, Aegor said with a shrug. This, Tyrion said, his tone laced with incredulity, is the most absurd story I've heard all year. If I had to choose, I think I'd sooner believe in the existence of White Walkers. Aegor was indeed making things up, but his lies weren't entirely baseless. The original author once mentioned that the world of Westeros is situated on a spherical planet, slightly larger than Earth, with a greater landmass. Aegor had personally verified this after arriving here. Based on the air pressure and gravity he could feel, the planetary environment of this world was strikingly similar to Earth's. If Martin's original setting held true in this reality, namely that the land area of the world is larger than Earth's, then it was entirely plausible that there might be land or significant islands in the vast ocean west of Westeros. Of course, no one would believe him if he claimed to be a transmigrator. Instead, his greatest assets for survival were his knowledge of the plot and understanding of the key players. These two secrets, however, could never be shared. Therefore, the mysterious Sunset Sea to the west of Westeros, an expanse unknown to most of its inhabitants, became a perfect fabrication for his supposed homeland. It's worth noting that Aegor's claim of coming from across the ocean wasn't a spur-of-the-moment invention. It was a story he'd already used when introducing himself to the Brothers of the Night's Watch. Its biggest advantage, no one could ever disprove it. And whenever he needed to add more details to his backstory, he could chalk it up to cultural or linguistic differences, leaving plenty of room to improvise. The idea of being part of a globe-spanning voyage was something Aegor had come up with on the fly during the dinner party. Though improvised, it wasn't entirely random, the inspiration behind it was obvious. The goal of spinning such a tale was also clear. By catering to Tyrion's curiosity and interests, Aegor could make an impression on a core member of House Lannister. If all went well, he could use this as a stepping stone to escape the constraints of the Night's Watch. For a man like Tyrion, a noble dwarf with great ambitions and a thirst for knowledge about the wider world, how many people could be more intriguing than an alleged explorer from an undiscovered continent? By claiming to have funded his own daring journey, Aegor hoped to present himself as someone of substance rather than a mere commoner in black robes. After over a year of adapting to this world, Aegor had come to understand one thing. In Westeros, your origins largely determined how others treated you. Slightly elevating his status when interacting with people was always a good strategy. Making subtle comments to imply that he was wealthy and free-spirited, rather than directly claiming noble birth, made the lie more believable. This disguise not only helped reduce the distance created by social class, but also provided a plausible explanation for his appearance and the breadth of his knowledge, which far exceeded that of the average person around him. It was in essence a two-for-one solution. Aegor didn't particularly enjoy lying, boasting, or pretending to be something he wasn't. But for the sake of his survival, he was willing to deceive the world if it meant staying alive. While Aegor schemed to present himself in the best possible light, the bastard Jon Snow was busy piecing together the broken sword fragments and had already noticed something peculiar. This break is strange, Jon muttered as he tried to reassemble the shattered blade. He frowned, struggling to articulate what felt wrong. If a steel weapon breaks, it shouldn't look like this. Exactly, Aegor interjected, finishing the thought Jon was trying to express. Normally you'd see some deformation or bending at the break, but here the fracture occurred precisely where the sword collided with the White Walker's weapon. Under the effects of ice magic, the steel lost its toughness, becoming brittle, more fragile than cast iron. It couldn't withstand the impact and broke cleanly in two. Jon stared at the two broken swords laid out before him, his expression darkening as he finally grasped the weight of his Uncle Benjen's warnings. This is absurd, Tyrion scoffed. He wasn't interested in broken swords or their mysteries, and he certainly didn't care how steel behaved under ice magic. What truly captured his attention was Aegor's supposed origin, while Tyrion wasn't entirely convinced by the tale. Something about Aegor's explanation felt genuine enough to him. He couldn't help but voice his outrage. You claim to hail from a continent unknown to us, which should make you one of the most important visitors to Westeros in 1,000 years. And yet the moment you arrived, a bunch of northerners arrested you and sent you to the wall. Are you really willing to stay in this frozen wasteland for the rest of your life? Of course I'm not willing, Aegor admitted with a self-deprecating smile. But what choice do I have? I'll help you leave, Tyrion said without hesitation. Aegor nearly choked on his own saliva. This was exactly what he wanted, but the offer had come far more quickly and easily than he'd expected. Could it be that he was finally catching a break after all the hardships he'd endured? Thank you for your kindness, my lord, but as far as I know, has there ever been a case in Westeros of someone leaving the Night's Watch and returning to a normal life? Not officially, Tyrion admitted, shrugging. Once you take the oath, you either serve for life or you're branded a deserter. There's no third option, but I didn't say I'd help you leave the Watch, I said I'd help you leave the Wall. What's the difference? Let me tell you a story, Tyrion began. There was once a nobleman who backed the wrong side in a political struggle. After his faction lost power, he was forced to join the Night's Watch. A few years later, the man he supported reclaimed the throne. That nobleman, now a sworn brother of the Night's Watch, returned to his family's castle under the pretense of collecting supplies for the Watch. He lived out his days in comfort, feasting, enjoying women, and never returning to the Wall until his death. What are you talking about? Jon finally looked up from the shattered sword, catching only part of their conversation. A Night's Watchman who doesn't guard the Wall, how can someone just ignore their oath like that? It's not as simple as it sounds, Tyrion explained. If the Lord Commander declares a brother a deserter, every lord and noble on the continent is obligated to hunt him down. But this man wasn't declared a deserter. Officially, he remained a collector of supplies for the Watch. The arrangement was beneficial for both sides. I see, Aegor murmured, the pieces clicking into place. He hadn't considered this approach before, but it made perfect sense. I suppose this nobleman didn't collect supplies through donations, did he? Of course not, Tyrion smirked. This kind of arrangement requires two things, thick skin and deep pockets. The man provided the Watch with enough resources to feed and supply its soldiers. Compared to that, one man's service at the Wall was insignificant. Aegor fell silent, stroking his chin in thought. The first requirement, thick skin, was no problem for him, but as for deep pockets, he had nothing. Compared to even the lowliest servant in Winterfell, his financial situation was laughable. How could he afford to buy his way out of the Watch? There was one man in Westeros who could afford such an expense, Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock and Warden of the West. If Tyrion's father was willing to help, Aegor's problem could be solved in an instant. But this was only their first meeting. How could he possibly make such a request? Why haven't I heard this story before? Jon asked suspiciously. Besides, the Night's Watch is supposed to be independent of the Seven Kingdoms. Even the king has no authority to interfere in its affairs. You haven't heard of it because it's not a northern tale and the man in question wasn't anyone significant, Tyrion replied. As for the king's authority, you're still young. When you grow up, you'll realize that anyone strong enough can interfere in anything they want. Jon flushed, struggling to find a retort, but the truth in Tyrion's words left him silent. I can help you with the first ransom, Tyrion said, turning back to Aegor. But you'll need to figure out the rest on your own, and I have one condition: you'll need to tell me more about Cena's advanced technology and customs. Thank you, my lord. Aegor's gratitude was genuine. Though the situation felt almost too good to be true, he had taken the right gamble after all. But he's sworn to the Night's Watch, Jon protested, momentarily forgetting the broken sword on the table. How can he just leave? So tell me, boy, Tyrion countered with a sharp grin, does it seem fair that an explorer from the far side of the world, the first Senar to set foot in Westeros, should spend the rest of his life freezing at the Wall because he took a few potatoes to survive a shipwreck? Jon sighed, looking conflicted. Fine, do what you want. I'll pretend I didn't hear this conversation. Thank you, but this isn't about desertion, Tyrion said calmly. Even if you told your father or the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch about this conversation, they couldn't do anything to me. This isn't some clandestine plot, it's an open secret. When you're older, you'll understand. Jon looked frustrated at being dismissed as a child but didn't respond. His attention drifted back to the broken swords on the table. After a moment of silence, he straightened his back and declared, I've decided I'm joining the Night's Watch. Before making life-altering decisions, it's best to calm down and think, Tyrion said, raising an eyebrow at Jon's sudden declaration. That said, I understand your reasoning. The wildlings are gathering under their king beyond the Wall, and the White Walkers lurk in the shadows with their ice magic. While everyone else runs from danger, the boldest among us walk straight toward it, seeking fame and glory. I'm not doing this for fame and glory, Jon shot back, his face reddening with emotion. His gaze hardened as he turned to the shattered weapons. I just want to protect my family and the millions of people in the north from the threats that come from beyond the Wall. Touching, Tyrion said with a slight smirk, but his voice carried no sarcasm this time. He turned to Aegor. It's settled then. I've decided to visit the Wall myself. They call it one of the 9 man-made wonders of the world, and I'd be a fool not to see it for myself. By the way, I'll also be able to verify whether this story of yours holds any truth. Perhaps we'll travel together. Robert Baratheon was not a good king. Few in the Seven Kingdoms or at court would argue otherwise. Although he had everything a man could want and lived a life of indulgence and excess, Robert was keenly aware of one thing: he neither liked nor trusted the Lannisters. His old hand of the king and adoptive father were both dead, leaving him uninterested in ruling and focused solely on pleasure. Yet even in his neglect of governance, he understood one fundamental truth: he could not allow the entire realm to fall into the hands of his queen's family. A kingdom's centers of power needed balance, and so Robert thought of his old friend Eddard Stark, whom he had left behind in the north. However, inviting the Warden of the North to King's Landing to serve as Hand of the King was no simple matter. The Society of Westeros functioned under a feudal system that, while familiar in some ways, was unique in others. But there was one glaring problem of the 8 great families currently ruling the 9 regions of Westeros. None of them, aside from Robert's own, owed their rise to the dynasty that now sat on the Iron Throne. The rebellion that toppled the Targaryen dynasty and placed Robert on the throne had been branded the Usurpers' War precisely because of this dynamic. The Baratheons had not so much changed the structure of the monarchy as they had replaced the Targaryens at its pinnacle. The realm itself remained much the same as it had been ever since Aegon the Conqueror first subdued the 7 kingdoms. The histories of Westeros made this clear. The Starks of the north, the Lannisters of the west, the Arryns of the Vale, and the Martells of Dorne had been kings in their own right before Aegon's conquest. They were rulers in both name and fact, recognized by their vassals and wielding unquestioned authority over their domains. After Aegon's dragons subdued them, these great houses simply gave up their royal titles, swore fealty to the Iron Throne, and continued to govern their lands largely as they always had. Meanwhile, the Tullys of the Riverlands, the Tyrells of the Reach, and the Grages of the Iron Islands had been elevated during the conquest. These families had risen from powerful vassals of the defeated kings of their regions to become lords paramount in their own right. They owed their status to their timely submission to Aegon and his dragons. As for the Baratheons, they had been brought into the ranks of the great houses only because their founder, Orys Baratheon, had been Aegon's loyal general during the conquest. Even Orys had faced significant challenges in securing his rule over the Stormlands. He had to seize Storm's End, marry the daughter of the deposed Storm King, and adopt her family's sigil words and traditions to stabilize his position. Aegon's victories, while decisive, relied heavily on his dragons as weapons of mass destruction. He subdued the 7 kingdoms, but lacked the infrastructure or resources to fully integrate them into a centralized state. He settled for feudal allegiances, allowing the great houses to maintain their autonomy as long as they recognized his sovereignty. This compromise was born of necessity, not choice. The harsh climate and geography of Westeros, combined with its primitive technology, sparse population, and underdeveloped transportation networks, made centralized governance impossible. Without a strong standing army or reliable communication, royal authority could only stretch so far. The farther a region was from the king's seat of power, the more likely it was to ignore his commands. This is why the concept of eradicating the roots rarely appeared in Westerosi politics. Even if a ruling family was overthrown, the victors still had to appoint local leaders to maintain order. Attempts to replace entrenched nobles with appointed officials often resulted in those officials turning into independent warlords, defying royal authority. Anyone who sought to break the status quo faced immense resistance, illustrating how backward productivity constrains political development. 300 years after Aegon's conquest, little had changed. The Targaryens had been replaced by the Baratheons, but the fundamental structure of the realm remained intact. Robert, as the head of the youngest and least established of the great houses, ruled from an unstable foundation. After the rebellion, he neither created new loyalist families nor possessed a weapon as devastating as dragons to consolidate his power. As a result, Robert sat on the Iron Throne but struggled to command the respect or authority needed to rule the 7 kingdoms effectively. It was little wonder he turned to drinking and hunting to distract himself. Robert's predicament was a textbook case of easier to seize a throne than to hold it. To secure his reign, he married Cersei Lannister, daughter of the wealthiest and most powerful family in the realm, despite his personal dislike of her. He relied on his foster father Jon Arryn as Hand of the King and strengthened alliances with the Stark and Tully families through marriage and friendship. These relationships formed a coalition of 5 houses, Baratheon, Stark, Lannister, Arryn, and Tully, that kept the remaining great houses, the Tyrells, Martells, and Greyjoys, in check. This lengthy explanation serves one purpose: to clarify that the man sitting on the Iron Throne is king in title only. His actual authority depends entirely on his ability to outmaneuver and overpower the other great houses. When strong, he is the king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, ruler of the 7 kingdoms and protector of the realm. When weak, he is merely another lord among equals and may even become a target for rebellion or invasion. Robert couldn't simply issue a royal decree to summon Eddard Stark to King's Landing. Eddard was the ruler of the North in all but name, and their relationship was one of brothers-in-arms, not king and vassal. Instead, Robert had to visit Winterfell personally. Not only did he need to persuade Eddard to become his hand, but he also aimed to propose a marriage alliance between their families. This would ensure that the coalition of the 5 houses remained intact even after Robert's death, giving the Baratheons a chance at longevity. Though Robert was an indulgent and flawed ruler, his noble upbringing and grasp of political strategy were not entirely lacking. For this reason, he had come to Winterfell and intended to stay for a while. Whether it was Gary and Will, low-ranking members of the Night's Watch, or men of higher status like Waymar Royce, Benjen Stark, and Lord Commander Jeor Mormont, or even the king, queen, and the Baratheons, Starks, and Lannisters he had met since arriving at Winterfell, all were different from how Aegor remembered them from the screen before his arrival in this world. This made it clear to him that he had not stepped into a fictional show, but a living, breathing reality. Fortunately, the recorded history, plot developments, and character personalities he had encountered so far still aligned closely with the stories he knew. This familiarity was his greatest advantage, allowing him to prepare and adapt his behavior when dealing with key figures. It's worth noting that the two people who had visited his room tonight were among the most important players in this world. Tyrion Lannister and Jon Snow were unquestionably pivotal characters. Judging by the original story, their development, and the sheer amount of time dedicated to their narratives, they stood at the forefront of the series, surpassing even Daenerys Targaryen in prominence. As such, Aegor had spent considerable time studying their personalities, growth arcs, and motivations before being transported to this world. His understanding of their characters, shaped by countless analyses, was likely deeper than their own self-awareness. Jon's decision to join the Night's Watch early, spurred by the evidence of White Walkers, was an unexpected development but ultimately harmless. For now, Jon was still just a boy with limited influence. On the other hand, Tyrion, with his noble lineage and sharp intellect, already wielded considerable power. And now, Aegor had secured the dwarf's promise of help. While it was merely a verbal agreement, Aegor's knowledge of Tyrion's character made him confident enough to place some trust in it. Still, the situation wasn't so simple. Tyrion, for all his intelligence and status, was not the king nor the true head of House Lannister. His power and resources ultimately depended on his father, Tywin Lannister, who had excluded Tyrion from the family's core political affairs. Even if Tyrion sincerely wanted to help, there was no guarantee of success. Moreover, according to the original plot, Tyrion himself would soon face obstacles preventing his return to the West or King's Landing. Before Aegor could fully rely on Tyrion's aid, he would have to carefully plan his next steps. Author's note: Tyrion's curiosity meets Aegor's secrets, and Jon's choices weigh heavier than steel. In this world, survival isn't won by strength but by cunning and timing. Crossed.
Thanks for watching.